So let us talk about the Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, who with his family would later be killed by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution. Solzhenitsyn's discussion of the Tsar is, if you think about it, a third flashback in this part of the book. The narrative of the story is pretty straightforward up until chapter 63, where Solzhenitsyn presents some stories from previous knots, previous key turning points in Russian history. Those knots are told in the form of three flashbacks. First, the flashback or knot of revolutionary violence told in the story of Bolgorov. Second is the knot around Stolypin and his reforms. Third is the story of the Tsar and his relationship to the changes afoot in Russia. Solzhenitsyn lists a total of 9 key events on his transition page to the section of flashbacks that lead up to August 1914. I've tried to identify what these knots are, but not always with success. In any event, we learn of Bolgorov, Stolypin, and Tsar Nicholas in these flashbacks. By the time August 1914 rolls around, Bolgorov has been executed, Stolypin is dead, only Tsar Nikolai remains. So what do we learn about the Tsar? The Tsar stands for what is best about the old order and what is decrepit about the old order. He is pious and recognizes providential history. He's a good family man. But all of this prevents him from acting decisively on the world and accepting things as God's will instead of, shall I say, making his own way. He is not a man of vision, mostly because he cannot picture a world without the Romanovs on top of Russia. Since they will survive, the method of acting might not matter. Solzhenitsyn constantly and obtrusively has Nikolai reflect on the difficulty of making decisions in a complex world or when one's advisors disagree. Stolypin knew what to do, but not the Tsar. The Tsar manifests the vacillation that Stolypin's statesmanship had tried to end, between a harsh repression or imposition of order on the one hand and a retreat into reform on the other. He obviously did not have the wherewithal to impose order and reform at the same time. The key event in the long chapter of 74 is the Russo-Japanese War and the call for reform in the wake of that disastrous war for Russia. This call for reform culminates with the Manifesto of 1905, where the Tsar calls for the establishment of a Duma, but it is in reality a concession squeezed out of him by force and threats. The Tsar feels that it is his destiny to move Russia to the east, to secure a path to the Pacific and a warm water port that he will need, and it is Port Arthur, a city to the east of Korea and though not technically to the south of Korea. Vladivostok sits on the north and west of Korea, Port Arthur to the east and south of Korea, by which I mean that it is a port that would allow Russia to sail south of Korea through the Yellow Sea. It is a warm water port that the Russians were building toward. Japan wanted Korea too, so there is the conflict. In any event, it was a key to developing, that is, Port Arthur was a key to developing the east of Russia, and Nikolai thought of it as a piece of cake to take. It wasn't, and when it wasn't, he didn't know what to do. He sent the Navy, but he didn't know if it would make the Baltic side more vulnerable. He wondered if a new commander would be needed, but he expressed loyalty and faith in God's will. Once the war was lost, he wondered what the right thing to do was in the faith of protests. Reform, hold his ground. Advisors, his wife, his family were all saying different things, and what was a poor Tsar to do? This is the portrait of the Tsar that emerges from this long chapter. And the chapter ends with 15 or so pages on July 1914, the month just before the book starts and the war starts, where Nikolai is hoping for a way out of the war and is carried along by events that lead up to the war. He never really understood what he was up against domestically or internationally. His faith in the Russian project was entirely out of proportion to its intrinsic merits. Now, what do these flashbacks yield artistically and convey theoretically? I would submit that it puts people in categories: revolutionaries, Bulgarov; reformers, Stolypin; and trusters or reactionaries, the Tsar. It shows how each of these groups reacted at various times in the run-up to the war. Revolutionaries chanted, "Down with autocracy." The Tsar trusted in the intrinsic necessity and goodness of autocracy. Stolypin thought through the need for order and the need for reform. We see the decrepitude and out-of-season nature of the old order. It is made up of decent people who cannot really be effective in their time and place. We see the radicalism of the revolutionaries comes from their ability to think through what would come after the revolution and to think through what human beings are really like. Hence, they are a dead end of endless revolution. And then we see the responsible reformers, those who love Russia and who know the need for slowish adaptation for her to survive. Bulgarov and the ants are in the first category. The Tsar and his generals are in the second. Stolypin, Vorontsov, they're in the third. What Russia needed was an alliance between the Tsar and the reformers. Chapter 74 shows that the Tsar lacked the vision and understanding of the way the ground had shifted, so he did not see the need to undertake such an alliance. His belief in providential status prevented him from seeing it. His faith in the timelessness of autocracy prevented him from seeing it. The Tsar and his allies see the reformers as revolutionaries, which of course makes the revolutionary left much more powerful. The reformers have a hold on political power. They have no hold on political power. This is the upshot to this addition to the second edition. As I have said, the new chapters in the second edition are chapters 60 through 74. The transition from the old chapter 59, as it is numbered in the second edition, or in the first edition is chapter 57, to the new chapter 60 is rather smooth. It is a continuation of the discussion between the old aunts and Veronica about revolution and the condition of happiness. This leads to a discussion of Bulgarov and so on. At the back end, the transition is a bit harder and less fluid. The first edition goes from the discussion between Veronica and the aunts to Veronica going to the university and meeting the medievalist professor. The second edition, the chapter on the Tsar, chapter 74, leads to the chapter featuring Veronica and the medievalist professor. This transition works theoretically if we notice that the subsequent chapters, the last chapters, that is chapters 75 through 82 in the second edition, are confrontations between those who are or who would be aligned with reform against revolutionaries and reactionaries. The framework Solzhenitsyn sets up with the Stolypin cycle, the new chapters from 60 to 74, becomes the story of the rest of the novel. The Battle of Tannenberg is over in chapters 57 and 58, but the book goes on explaining why it came to that politically, that is the new inclusion, and what would be learned by the Tsarist regime in the aftermath of Tannenberg. Chapters 59 through 82 constitute this section of the book, and I must go further. This ending of the novel starts with the past, chapters 60 through 74, and ends with the future, chapters 75 through 82. The main character in the first part, that is the part about the past, is Stolypin. The main characters in the second part are a medievalist professor, a couple of reformist engineers, and Vorontsov. The first two, that is the medievalist professor and the reformist engineers, battle with revolutionaries, while the last, Vorontsov, addresses the reactionaries. Let us turn to these confrontations in what will, I hope, be our last video.